Committee will come to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 4979, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Thought we had one, right? Who? This is Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta has a bipartisan amendment. The clerk will read the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4979, offered by Mr. Latta.
And the amendment will be considered as read. And the staff will distribute the amendment. And the gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And this is a manager's amendment. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Congressman McNerney. And I have been working on a bipartisan manager's amendment to address issues raised by stakeholders that make a few clarifications and corrections to the underlying bill. One I'd like to highlight is a change in the definition for advanced nuclear. We struck the word fission after talking with advanced reactor groups involved in the fusion energy sector. We want to make sure that this licensing framework is technology neutral. The manager amendment also requires NRC to consider, not picking up, is that better? The manager amendment also requires the NRC to consider cost-sharing options associated with a phased licensing review process to increase certainty for license applicants and the investors funding the technology. The manager amendment also includes a provision to protect taxpayers from incurring new liabilities from the Department of Energy, engages with private sector entities to develop innovative technologies. And I'd yield to Mr. McNerney if he would like some of my time.
Thank you. I want to thank Mr. Latta for working on a bipartisan method to get this done. Now, this is the way things should be around here, working together, making compromises. This is what this is. The manager's amendment reflects a continued bipartisan effort, and I believe the manager's amendment improves the underlying bill, so I support the amendment, and I yield back.
And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, ranking member, for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment makes a few common sense tweaks to the underlying bill. It provides more time for NRC to put together the advanced reactor regulatory framework. More importantly, it includes a new section setting forth liability protections for the federal government in cases where a private entity is hosting a reactor on Department of Energy land. There have been recent legislative proposals directing DOE to host privately funded prototype nuclear reactors to demonstrate advanced nuclear technologies, but those proposals ignore completely the lack of a clear regulatory scheme and the significant new potential liability that would be borne by the federal government and ultimately the U.S. taxpayers. The language in the Latta Amendment would stop DOE from moving forward on hosting any of these privately funded novel nuclear reactor demonstrations until a few common sense boxes are checked. First, DOE must ensure that the private entities are insured in the event of an accident in the same manner as other nuclear operators. Second, even though these would be housed on DOE property, these reactors and their private sponsors must meet the same decommissioning requirements as those reactors constructed on private property. And third, there needs to be a place to dispose of any waste generated by these projects before they go into operations, so DOE cannot begin work on such a program until a final decision is made on a license application for a permanent repository. So I actually think the amendment should go farther to ensure that these projects are subject to licensing and oversight by the NRC. However, I think that we have here sends a strong message about the multitude of gaps in these proposals and the danger to the U.S. taxpayer who could be on the hook for untold millions of dollars if everything works fine, and a lot more in the event of an accident. So I urge all my colleagues to support the amendment and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Latta and Mr. McNerney. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further bipartisan amendments to the bill? Chair would recognize Mr. Schrader.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 4979, offered by Mr. Schrader.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support
Thank
of
you,
his
Mr.
amendment.
Chairman. H.R. 4979, the Advanced Nuclear Technology Development Act, supports advanced nuclear reactors with significant design improvements over existing fleet of nuclear reactors. The safety improvements used in some new reactor designs nearly eliminate the possibility of a critical nuclear accident from ever occurring. The innovations are transformational and may change the way the world views nuclear energy. It's important because safe nuclear power, along with a growing portfolio of renewable energy sources, can play an important role in carbon-free baseload electricity in the future. However, the innovation of nuclear power cannot occur unless the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is prepared to use a regulatory framework that is risk-informed, efficient, and cost-effective. The companies developing these new technologies each face more than $1 billion in development costs and nearly 2 decades to complete these designs. The NRC design review process is rightly viewed as an international gold standard. However, if the NRC fails to implement and facilitate a reliable regulatory framework, then the significant investment in these new technologies could be lost. H.R. 4979 directs NRC to develop a licensing plan for advanced nuclear testing and licensing. However, there are some advanced technologies, including the NuScale Power Small Modular Reactor, that are moving much faster. NuScale, based in Corvallis, Oregon, intends to submit its design certification application to the NRC by the end of the calendar year. To date, NuScale and its parent company have spent nearly $600 million over the last 15 years developing its innovative and safe design. NRC has stated it can complete that review within 40 months. Seems like a long time. Unfortunately, the recent history in NRC's design review process raises questions whether or not it can complete that review in 40 months. The most recent design license, for example, reviewed by the NRC, took 9 years. My amendment simply asks the NRC to report annually on the status of each advanced nuclear design certification review. If NRC falls behind the schedule due to their own actions, the amendment simply requires NRC to develop a plan and identify the resources needed to recover the schedule and put some certainty in the process. Mr. Chairman, I believe the NRC should ultimately take as long as it needs to ensure all reactor designs are safe. This amendment will help the NRC stay on track and its review process, and offers additional transparency, efficiency, and certainty to make sure these reviews are completed on time. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman yields back. Chair to recognize gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank my colleague from Oregon, Representative Schrader, for leading on this amendment. I strongly support the amendment as well and encourage its passage. Oregon is currently home to the leading development of American small modular reactor technology. 2013, the Department of Energy supported the development of this technology by awarding a grant to NuScale to further develop SMR technology. This is a good program. I think this amendment makes a lot of sense, and I fully support it.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment offered by Mr. Schrader? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Schrader. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4979 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 4775 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4775, to facilitate efficient state implementation of ground-level ozone standards and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, and I'll come back to you, Mr. Rush. Has an amendment at the desk?
I have an amendment to this, yes, sir.
And the clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 4775, offered by Mr. Olson.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I thank the chair. This amendment addresses two concerns raised by the states relating to H.R. 4775. First, H.R. 4775 provides additional time to implement new permitting requirements under the 2015 ozone standards. The bill also provides additional time to implement future permitting requirements. EPA fails to issue timely permitting regulations or guidance, receives revised standards in the future. In written testimony on H.R. 4775, the chairman of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the TCEQ, Brian Shaw, noted that the bill's definition of, quote, pre-construction permit, end quote, includes only major sources and does not include minor sources, which may also be required by EPA to obtain pre-construction permits. He raised concerns under the bill that major and minor sources could be treated differently in terms of regulatory relief available. My amendment would revise the definition of pre-construction permit to include both major and minor sources. Ozone is ozone. This will ensure all stationary sources are treated consistently in the bill for permitting purposes. Second, Section 3F of H.R. 4775 clarifies that economic feasibility should be considered when developing state implementation plans for moderate and serious ozone non-attainment areas. The bill, as introduced, was inadvertently failed to include extreme ozone non-attainment areas in this clarification. My amendment will make this clarification for extreme ozone non-attainment areas. This change is consistent with EPA's responses to the questions for the record submitted to the committee last fall, in which the agency stated, quote, when designing their state implementation plan to implement the NACs, state and local officials have authority to consider several factors, including employment impacts and costs of controls, end quote. The changes in my amendment are limited and help implementation of new air quality standards. I urge support for this amendment.
I'm going to yield for just
Yep.
a minute.
Yes, sir. Yield.
I just wanted to point out also that at the legislative hearing, the executive director of the San Joaquin Air Pollution Control District in California, which is one of the areas that has the most difficulty of complying with any of these ozone standards, and particularly the 2008 standard, and they're very much concerned about this new standard, talked about in his testimony the vital importance of being able to consider economic feasibility. And I think Mr. Olson's amendment directly affects that point. And these requests are coming in from those areas that are most hard hit by these ozone regulations, unable to meet them, and are insisting and requesting that Congress allow the EPA to consider the economic feasibility of the regulation. So I would yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will recognize gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in opposition to this amendment. This amendment appears to only make a few technical changes to the bill. However, these changes only add to the problems with the bill. First, under Section 3D, until EPA issues the required regulations and guidance, new or expanding major sources of pollution get amnesty from the Clean Air Act requirements when applying for a pre-construction permit. Applying outdated air quality standards for permitting creates a loophole in the Clean Air Act that would allow new or expanding facilities to emit more pollution than is safe. The Olson Amendment would expand this loophole to include minor statutory sources as well, and that just adds to problems caused by Section 3D. In other words, more air pollution, more pollution control costs for existing businesses, more litigation, and more permitting delays. Second, the Olson Amendment would allow areas with the dirtiest air to avoid making steady progress towards clean air. The Clean Air Act requires non-attainment areas to reduce their pollution by specific percentages in order to demonstrate that they're making reasonable further progress in cleaning up the air. The amendment would give extreme non-attainment areas the ability to waive their reduction requirements by allowing them to consider the cost of making such reductions. So the upshot of the Olson Amendment is more uncontrolled pollution and fewer requirements for cleaning it up. So I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. New Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Illinois.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk, Rush 01.
Rush 1. The clerk will read the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4775, offered by Mr. Rush.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 4775 would unacceptably delay implementation of the EPA's 2015 ozone standards for another 8 years, while also mandating that EPA wait a decade before considering any new evidence regarding the health implications from ozone and other harmful pollutants, despite what the science may say in the interval. Mr. Chairman, for those of us who believe that science should inform policy making in regards to public health decisions, delaying the 2015 standards and prohibiting the EPA from revisiting the scientific evidence for at least a decade is an unacceptable risk that could result in potentially disastrous health impacts for the American public. Mr. Chairman, we know that breathing in dirty pollutants such as ozone, carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen, sulfur dioxide, and many other dirty pollutants can lead to a host of health problems, including asthma, inflammation of the lungs, respiratory disease, and even premature deaths. Mr. Chairman, current research even suggests that ozone may also cause damage to the central nervous system and may harm developing fetuses. Yet, despite all of the scientific research, this bill would stall the new ozone standards, permanently weaken the Clean Air Act, and hamstring EPA's abilities to regulate these harmful contaminants both now and in the future. In fact, under this bill, not only would states have to comply with the 2015 standards until 2026, but parents would not even be informed if their communities were in violation of clean air standards until the year 2025. Mr. Chairman, I can think of no benefit to the public interest of denying citizens information directly tied to their health and to their well-being. Instead of trying to stall the 2015 ozone standards and prohibit EPA from regularly updating the national ambient air quality standards, as H.R. 4775 would do, we should be heeding the warnings of doctors, heeding the warnings of scientists, of not acting quickly enough to protect the public health. In order to address some of the deficiencies found in this bill, I am offering an amendment that will nullify sections from taking effect, even if they may result in adverse public health impacts. My amendment simply states that Section 2A would cease to apply if the EPA administrator, in consultation with the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee, finds that it could increase health problems, including asthma attacks, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart attacks, babies with low birth rate, and impaired fetal growth, neurological damage, premature mortality, or other serious harms to human health, especially for vulnerable populations such as pregnant women, children, the elderly, outdoor workers, and low-income communities. Mr. Chairman, with over 371,000 adult cases of asthma and close to 99,000 cases of pediatric asthma in my home county, Cook County, Illinois, I cannot afford to support a bill that may, in fact, aggravate this problem rather than make it much better. Mr. Chairman, this is a common sense amendment that seeks to put the interests of the public above the interests of industry, and I urge all my colleagues to support it. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Other members wishing to speak, Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. A wise man once said, those who cannot learn from history's mistakes are doomed to repeat them. EPA's recent history with ozone standards should never be repeated. New standards came out in 2008. Those rules to make those standards and implement them came out early in 2015, 7 years later. 6 months after that, new standards came out. That's not fair. It's not fair to EPA. It's not fair to industry. It's not fair to clean air. This amendment makes that same mistake by allowing the administrator to nullify one of the central provisions of this bill. Section 2A would allow states to fully implement the 2008 standards before turning to the 2015 standards. Regarding those 2015 standards, EPA projects, and this is a quote, the vast majority of U.S. counties will meet the 2015 ozone standards by 2025, just with the rules and programs now in place or underway, end quote. So this bill will also ensure these hundreds of counties that EPA projects are already on track to meet the 2015 standards can come into compliance without being hit with additional regulatory burdens, paper requirements, and restrictions, which will not do anything to improve public health. Since 1980, ozone levels have declined by 33%, and the EPA projects air quality, another quote, will continue to improve over the next decade as additional reductions in ozone precursors from power plants, motor vehicles, and other sources are realized, end quote. Nothing in this pending bill prevents these improvements to the air quality from being realized. I urge a no vote on this amendment.
Mr. Olson, will you yield?
Yield, yes, sir.
I want to make another comment. A number of years ago, we had a number of forums on the Clean Air Act, and also at the hearing on this legislation, many state EPA regulators have all expressed concern that when EPA comes out with a new regulation, they do not provide states with the implementation guidelines. For example, on the 2008 ozone standard, EPA did not come out with the implementation guidelines to help the states until 2015, some 7 years later. And so this Section 2A is in the bill at the request of many state EPA authorities because of the fact that EPA at the federal level does not issue the implementing guidelines. And so this Section 2A is just a common sense provision being requested by state EPAs because the federal EPA not doing its job of getting these guidances out. And as much respect as I have Mr. Rush, he in effect would eliminate Section 2A, basically if the administrator decides to do that. So I respectfully oppose his amendment, and I'm glad that Mr. Olson in his bill has Section 2A in the bill. Thank you.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishes. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak in support of the Rush Amendment. The American public has waited far too long for adequate protection from high levels of ozone. The promise of the Clean Air Act's air quality standards is healthy air for the entire nation, but the previous ozone standard has fallen short, and since 2008, it has been weaker than the science and the law would allow. So last fall, EPA strengthened the ozone standard based on yet another exhaustive review of the scientific evidence. EPA's stronger ozone standard would help avoid a litany of adverse health impacts, from asthma attacks in children to missed school days and premature deaths. But this bill would essentially say that the negative consequences of ozone pollution and the benefits of cleaner air don't matter. Section 2A of the bill would block EPA from implementing their updated ozone standard, jeopardizing the health and safety of all Americans. Mr. Chairman, the bill's supporters argue that the purpose of Section 2A is merely to give states enough time to implement EPA's 2015 ozone standard, and proponents have time and again stated that it's not intended to roll back any of the existing health protections afforded in the Clean Air Act. But these claims are preposterous for a bill that radically changes numerous provisions of the law that ensures we all breathe safe air. If Republicans want to claim that this bill is not an attack on the Clean Air Act and public health, there should be no objection to Mr. Rush's amendment. It simply states that implementation of EPA's 2015 ozone standard would not be delayed if the EPA administrator determines that doing so causes serious harm to human health, including asthma attacks and other respiratory disease, heart attacks, birth defects, brain damage, or premature death. Swift implementation of the new ozone standard has meaningful real-world benefits. These public health benefits and air quality protections are especially important for the most vulnerable among us, babies, kids, seniors, and they all would be needlessly blocked by this bill. Americans rely on the EPA to hold polluters responsible for cleaning up their pollution. It's just common sense. If you stop EPA from doing its job, public health will suffer. If you don't want to block efforts to clean up air pollution that is contributing to asthma attacks, heart attacks, lung disease, birth defects, neurological damage, and premature death, then support this amendment. And adoption of Mr. Rush's amendment will make it perfectly clear that EPA can continue to clean up air pollution that causes serious health effects. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word in support of the Rush Amendment. My background as a public health nurse has revealed to me that our environment has such a direct link to our health. And that's why health prioritization and consideration within the Clean Air Act has been so important. Clean air is so fundamental to public health, but it also has important impacts on our nation's fiscal health. Cleaner air means healthier individuals who have fewer medical needs and lower medical expenses, take fewer sick days, and have an overall better quality of life. And clean, safe air is especially important for children, the elderly, individuals with otherwise compromised immune systems. And that is why the Clean Air Act is constructed the way it is and why it's worked as well as it has. The law recognizes that we should be setting standards that are in line with public health needs, and we have all benefited from this. Unfortunately, this bill strays from the underlying intention of the Clean Air Act, and it does compromise the intention of protecting public health. And this places all of us at risk. Ozone and the other criteria of pollutants included within the Clean Air Act have all been shown to directly impact public health. Exposure to these pollutants is, at the bottom line, simply dangerous. While it's undeniable that these pollutants are dangerous for everyone, certain individuals and communities are more at risk than others. The loopholes and delays provided for in the legislation before us would put everyone, but particularly these vulnerable communities, like children, like the elderly, at risk. And this is unacceptable. Mr. Rush's amendment is a common sense approach to ensure that we maintain our commitment to protect public health for everyone, as the Clean Air Act intends, not just for a privileged few. Without it, we risk putting Americans at risk for an increase in the rate of asthma attacks, respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart attacks, neurological damage, premature mortality, prematurity, and birth defects. The Rush Amendment is critical to addressing these risks. That's why I strongly support it, urge my colleagues to support it as well, and yield to my to yield back or yield to someone else.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Mr. Shimkus is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is always very curious because this whole debate is how long can EPA really get out the standards? How long do we allow industry to try to comply? And what's happened here is we just have how to comply with the 2008 standards, and they come down with a new higher standard. So how can the industry do that? So all Section 2 says, let's give us, in essence, the same amount of time to implement the new 2015 standards as you took to roll out the 2008 standards. I mean, surely we have to appreciate the fact that ratcheting down ozone emissions, someone would even argue whether it's at background levels or not. We're not even getting into that debate. But surely we ought to give the sector time to implement it, and the capital expense that needs to be raised and the construction to be placed on the utilities so that they can do it. I mean, for the life of me, this is just a very curious debate when we have a 2008 standard that they now tell us how to comply with, and while they're telling us to comply with the 2008 standard, they come down with a new 2015 standard. So Section 2 is very, very important if you want to at least give some hope to the sector that when there's new standards that come down, we really believe and want them to try to meet those by giving them the time to be able to do so. So it's a curious debate. I want to support the inclusion of Section 2 in the bill, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, colleagues. I'd like to support the Rush Amendment, and the Rush Amendment goes to the heart of why the Clean Air Act is so important to American families and American businesses. Since 1970, the Clean Air Act and then its amendments have ensured that the air that we breathe is clean, and it is based on science, and it's the science and the public health that helps drive policy. Unfortunately, this bill is an irresponsible compilation of attacks that strike at the heart of the Clean Air Act. Mr. Rush's amendment tries to fix this, but it doesn't sound like our Republican colleagues are going to be interested in it, unfortunately. Because what the bill does is it undermines decades of progress on cleaning up pollution and protecting the public health from all pollutants, not just ozone. The core of the Clean Air Act requires the EPA to review the science every 5 years. The Republican bill says, no, we're not interested in the science every 5 years. We want to lengthen that. So what you're saying to our neighbors is that you're not going to let them know what's in the air that they breathe? That's not fair. After the 5-year review, the EPA then sets the health-based standards called the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are set at a level based on the best science to protect the public health, including the health of sensitive groups like our children and our older neighbors. Essentially, those standards determine what level of air pollution is safe to breathe. Like I said before, our neighbors deserve to know what is in the air that they breathe. And then the cost and feasibility of projects is then considered by states when implementing the standard. The problem with this bill is that it undermines the health-based decision-making, which has been central to the success of our ambient air quality standards in cleaning up pollution. It removes the important firewall, separating the setting of standards from their implementation, and virtually guarantees that the public will never know what level of air quality is truly safe. And despite repeated claims that achieving clean air was just not feasible, Over the past decades, look around. We've made such great progress. American ingenuity has consistently risen to the challenge and made our country the leader in both clean air and clean air technology. Just look at what's happening in China and India right now. Their economies are suffering because they just cannot get a handle on air pollution. It's very detrimental to the health of those countries. Meanwhile, in America, we have clean air, and we have the strongest economy in the world. So why would you want to gut the Clean Air Act and go back on that? It's really what sets America apart from other countries in the world. So I would ask my colleagues, please adopt the Rush Amendment to make this bill a little bit better. But in the end, I ask you, don't gut the Clean Air Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none. Vote will occur. Roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll on the amendment offered by Mr. Rush.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes yes. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes yes. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Mrs. Clark. Mrs. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Ms. Elmers.
Ms. Elmers votes no.
Dr. Murphy.
Dr. Murphy votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 21 ayes and 28 noes.
21 ayes, 28 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Mr. Pompeo has an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment at the desk.
And the
I think it's
clerk will
number
report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4775, offered by Mr. Pompeo.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a simple amendment. It expands the study provisions of H.R. 4775. Currently, the bill requires a study on the impacts of international transport. That's good. However, I believe there are two other issues that require significant technical and policy analysis in order for states to develop more effective state implementation plans to control ozone. To that end, the amendment would add two additional studies. The first study is on the relative effectiveness of NOx and VOC reductions in urban and rural areas. This will help states in planning cost-effective control strategies. The last time such a study was conducted was in the early 1990s by the National Research Council, and it is time to update that study. The amount of ozone created or destroyed in the atmosphere is largely determined by the relative concentrations of NOx and VOCs in the air. Understanding this unique chemistry in each non-attainment area of the country is critical to developing successful plans to reduce ozone. Plans that are not informed by the best available science can actually cause ozone to increase. States must have confidence that such costly investments will actually reduce ozone. The second study requires EPA to examine wintertime ozone in western ozone non-attainment areas. This is a new phenomenon. EPA has stated that it does not have adequate tools to model this ozone formation mechanism. States need to know how to model the new phenomenon in order to develop effective control strategies. Without this assessment, states may end up developing state plans and control strategies that are only marginally effective. Moreover, if these plans fail, states could end up being sanctioned for failing to attain the lower 2015 ozone standards, despite having undertaken best efforts to reduce local emissions. This study will improve our understanding of the cause of these higher wintertime ozone readings and the most cost-effective control strategies for achieving reductions in wintertime ozone levels. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, Mr. Whitfield.
I want to thank Mr. Pompeo for offering this amendment because once again on the legislative hearing on this issue, a number of people raised the phenomenon that with nitrogen oxide reduction, emission reductions throughout the United States, the ozone levels have been improving throughout the eastern United States. And yet, despite the similar reductions in the emissions on the western United States, the ozone levels have not been improving on the west. And so we need to have a better understanding of why that is the case. And that's precisely what this amendment is designed to do. And I might just add also on the winter ozone study, most scientific studies of ozone have focused on the summertime ozone in urban areas. And the summer ozone formation chemistry is well characterized. Wintertime ozone, on the other hand, is a relatively new phenomenon limited to a few isolated basins in the Intermountain West, and its causes are not fully understood. And that was brought out very clearly in our legislative hearing on this, and that's why I want to thank Mr. Pompeo for, in this amendment, authorizing this additional study to have a better understanding of this. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members, which gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in opposition to the Pompeo amendment. It seems innocuous enough, requiring EPA to conduct a study on ozone formation, wintertime ozone formation, and control strategies and report back to Congress. But in reality, this amendment is a wolf in sheep's clothing. First, many of the aspects of this proposed study are already covered by the EPA's Integrated Science Assessment. Integrated Science Assessments are reports that represent concise evaluations and synthesis of the most policy-relevant science for reviewing the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Essentially, these assessments form the scientific foundation for the review of the NAAQS standards, and all integrated science assessments are vetted through a rigorous peer review process, including review by the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee and public comment periods. But the Pompeo amendment would inject costs into this scientific process by requiring the assessment of cost-effective control strategies to reduce ozone. While this is certainly a worthy issue to review, EPA's scientific assessments are the wrong venue for such a discussion. Requiring EPA to do additional assessments of cost-effective control strategies would, of course, pull the agency's limited staff and resources away from the public health priorities of implementing and reviewing the NAAQS in the timely manner outlined in the Clean Air Act. When viewed in connection with the other provisions of this bill, like the requirement that implementing regulations and guidance must be issued concurrently with an air quality standard for pre-construction permits, this study would only serve to further delay implementation of the 2015 ozone standards. The 2015 ozone NAAQS update is long overdue, and the bill before us doesn't need any further procedural hoops for EPA to jump through before a more protective ozone standard can go into effect. And so I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion share, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Other amendments to the bill? Gentleman from New Jersey has an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is amendment number 3.
Number 3. Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4775, offered by Mr. Pallone.
Amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is straightforward, and it fixes one of the most egregious provisions in the bill, the consideration of technological feasibility in the NAAQS setting process. The bill's approach would make feasibility a factor in the scientific decision about how much pollution is safe for a child to breathe without experiencing an asthma attack. Requiring EPA to consider technological feasibility when setting an air quality standard is a dangerous precedent that ignores the history of the Clean Air Act, and frankly, it's not even necessary. Since 1970, the Clean Air Act has had several key features that have helped make it one of the most successful environmental laws in our country. The law's science-based health protective standards keep our eye on the prize, which is healthy air for everyone. Cooperative federalism allows EPA to set the clean air goals, and then states have to decide how best to achieve them. And the Clean Air Act uses regulatory standards like the NAAQS to drive technological innovation in pollution controls. We know from decades of experience that the Clean Air Act drives innovations in pollution controls that then become the industry standard. Once an air pollution standard is in place, industry gets to work to meet it, and along the way we develop more effective and less expensive pollution control technologies. Not only is our air cleaner, but we also export tens of billions of dollars of pollution control equipment all over the world, and we have seen this happen over and over again. But Section 3B ignores this fact and rejects an approach that has been successful for over 4 decades. So my amendment would restore current law, preserving the NAAQS as purely health-based standards and leaving the consideration of cost and feasibility to the states. If you truly believe that this bill is not an attack on the Clean Air Act and its critical public health protection, then supporting my amendment should not be a problem. In closing, almost every time EPA proposes a significant new requirement, opponents tell us it can't be done, it's going to cost too much, it's going to destroy our economy. You've heard this before. And Republicans are once again raising the false specter of job losses and high economic costs to try to block the implementation of stronger ozone standards. These doomsday claims about the cost of clean air are nothing new. The history of the Clean Air Act is a history of exaggerated claims by industry that have never come true. Section 3B is just the latest in a string of reckless legislative attacks on these purely health-based air quality standards, which can unravel the entire framework of the Clean Air Act. It ignores decades of experience in cleaning up air pollution. It's an extreme and, I think, irresponsible proposal that would put the health of all Americans at risk. So I urge adoption of my amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to, Mr. Olson is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I'll be brief. Sadly, this amendment makes the mistake of the past with EPA and new ozone emissions. Section 3B does not allow EPA to set an unhealthy standard. Like everyone in this room, I don't want my kids or any of the kids in America to breathe dirty air. Section 3B clearly says that EPA can only use economics in a new standard if it is within the range that their science advisors says will protect people. Economics is a secondary consideration. Health is still the number one priority. Here's the bill language that's in dispute. This is a quote. The administrator may consider as a secondary consideration likely technological feasibility in establishing and revising the national primary ambient air quality standards for this pollutant. May consider, not must consider. This bill simply clarifies that EPA administrator has discretion to consider technology when choosing among a range of levels identified and supported by the science protective of public health. Let's help EPA to make the Clean Air Act work. I urge a no vote for this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. There's a gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, as we consider this legislation that really cuts to the core of the Clean Air Act, I want to just take a few minutes to recognize the success of this bedrock environmental law, which has really benefited the people of our country for the last 4.5 decades. That's almost a half a century. So this law has gone a long way to benefit the people of our country. Since President Nixon signed the Clean Air Act into law in 1970, the nationwide concentration of lead air pollution has been reduced by 98%. Carbon monoxide has been cut by 85%, sulfur dioxide by 80%, and nitrogen dioxide by 60%. Now, these are dramatic reductions, and they've prevented hundreds of thousands of premature deaths, extended the life expectancy of millions of Americans, and they've aided in the cognitive development of millions of children who otherwise would have been poisoned with lead and other toxic pollutants. These benefits are not theoretical. They're not theoretical. They've been quantified and verified by peer-reviewed studies. A 2011 study found that the Clean Air Act will deliver benefits that exceed costs by a 30-to-1 ratio by the year 2020. So that's one heck of a ROI. And it's also clear that capping air pollution does not preclude economic growth. Since 1970, air pollution levels for the 6 criteria air pollutants have been cut an average of 69%, and the gross domestic product of our country has grown by 238%. This legislation, 4775, eliminates the core Clean Air Act principle that air pollution should be capped at a level that is protective of human health. Instead, the bill injects economic and technological considerations into what's always been a strictly science-based product. But we've got problems with science today, and unfortunately right here at this committee and throughout the Congress. The bill before us today lengthens from 5 to 10 years the time period between mandatory EPA reviews of air pollution standards, and these standards need to be continually updated to ensure that they're protected of human health. I think that the Clean Air Act stands for the landmark principle that all Americans have the right to breathe clean air. I know that probably the overwhelming majority of members of this committee have at some point traveled to China. And I don't think anyone has failed to notice that no matter where you go in the country, the citizens of that country have to wear masks. They can't even breathe the air of their own country. So when you contrast what President Nixon signed into law, the overwhelming achievements that have come as a result of it, the economic growth that has accompanied it, I don't think that this law deserves a kidney punch. This is something that has served the American people very well. And the bill before us today would only grant Americans that right for clean air if industry says it's okay. And I don't think the standards, those standards are the standards that meet with the what the American people deserve. So I think this is the wrong approach, Mr. Chairman, and I strongly oppose the legislation, and I hope others will as well. Thank you. Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? I'm sorry. A gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I fully support the Pallone Amendment, and I urge all my colleagues to do the same. H.R. 4775 would fundamentally alter provisions of the Clean Air Act by imposing cost and technological feasibility considerations on the standard-setting process. This change will upend long-standing criteria, Mr. Chairman, that require these decisions to be based primarily on medical science and health considerations, a policy that has been in place for 46 years now. Mr. Chairman, this drastic change to the nation's most historically important environmental law will lead to adverse consequences for both the public health and the resourcefulness of the American companies and American innovators. Mr. Chairman, as the EPA's acting Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation, Janet McCabe, noted in her written testimony to the Energy and Power Subcommittee for a hearing entitled H.R. 4775 Ozone Standards Implementation Act on April 14, 2016, and I quote, "Despite repeated assertions that achieving clean air was not feasible, American ingenuity has consistently risen to the challenge and made our country the leader in both clean air and clean air technology. That approach has been very successful for both the health of Americans and also for our economy." Mr. Chairman, it seems to me that what is missing in the argument made by the majority against the Clean Air Act, as well as arguments against other environmental protection laws, is the fact that these regulations have been extraordinarily beneficial, not only to the public health, but also to our economy. In almost every instance, Mr. Chairman, whenever a new environmental regulation has been proposed, we have heard opponents label them as job killers, overly burdensome, harmful to the economy, the end of the American way of life as we know it. And in practically every instance, those dire predictions have proven to be unequivocally wrong, as these laws have served to protect the public health as well as spur new advances in technologies and services that we can then export overseas. Mr. Chairman, undoubtedly, today's fight over the new ozone standards will follow this very same pattern. So for these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I strongly support the Pallone Amendment, because the Clean Air Act clearly states that only medical and public health data should be used when setting clean air health standards. This standard has worked effectively since 1970 and has even been supported unanimously by a Supreme Court decision authored by none other than former Justice Antonio Scalia. Mr. Chairman, it would be a grave mistake to alter this successful standard-setting process that has served the public and protected the public, as well as has stimulated our national economy. I strongly support the Pallone Amendment, and I urge all of my colleagues to do the same.
Would the gentleman yield? Mr. Rush, would you yield?
I yield.
I just want to make one comment. This section that you all are trying to strike does not mandate anything. It simply gives EPA administrator, it says that he may consider this. So there's no mandate here. It's simply at his discretion. And I'll yield back the time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Rush. A roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton.
I'm
Mr.
sorry, it's Mr. Pallone's amendment. I'm sorry. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Capps. Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Mrs. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to vote? Mr. Barton.
I'd like to say, Mr. Chairman, what a fine-looking bunch of fellows and ladies.
Yeah.
Mr. Barton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 22 ayes and 29 noes.
22 ayes, 29 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Ms. Castor has an amendment. Number 4.
Number 4.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4775, offered by Ms. Castor.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a simple targeted amendment that strikes subsection 3D of the bill. Section 3D creates a loophole in the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act requires major new or expanding sources of air pollution to obtain permits before they start construction. The Act recognizes that part of cleaning up ongoing pollution is to minimize the amount of new pollution added to a particular area. Now, to obtain a permit for a new source, a new emitter, an applicant must first determine which pollution controls it will install to reduce a facility's emissions. Then the applicant must estimate how much pollution the facility will emit after installing pollution controls. And the applicant must show that this quantity of pollution will not cause the area to exceed the national ambient air quality standards. If the new facility's emissions will cause a violation of the air quality standards, the applicant can choose to take additional steps to cut its emissions or obtain offsets for the excess pollution. EPA updates and strengthens the national air quality standards when the science says it's necessary to protect human health with an adequate margin of safety. But subsection 3D in the bill allows certain facilities to disregard the science and ignore a new air quality standard when obtaining a permit. It says that if EPA doesn't issue rules and guidance at the exact same time it issues a new air quality standard, the outdated air quality standards apply for the purposes of that pre-construction permit. This means that when a facility is demonstrating whether its emissions will violate the air quality standard, it would use the old, weaker standard as a benchmark. So in effect, this provision gives new polluters amnesty from the applicable air quality standard. These facilities will be allowed to emit extra pollution at levels that could harm the human health. Now, last Congress, we considered a similar legislative proposal, and a number of states raised a lot of concerns. We heard from states like Delaware that this provision, quote, would likely cause substantial adverse health impacts by exempting sources from complying with health-based air quality standards. And the California Air Resources Board sent a letter raising similar concerns, noting that this provision bars permitting agencies from applying the new air quality standard in the permitting process. And they said, quote, even if public health concerns would otherwise warrant doing so, end quote. California argued that this provision could actually slow the permitting process by forcing states to wait for EPA guidance, even if the state doesn't think that guidance is necessary to issue permits. And Delaware told us the same thing. So we have to be careful with this because it appears that Section 3D of the bill would be bad for the businesses in the area. If one facility emits more than its fair share of pollution, other facilities will have to pick up the slack and control more. So by granting amnesty to new sources of pollution, the provision shifts the pollution control responsibility to existing businesses, and that's not fair. This shift will raise pollution control costs overall for the manufacturing sector. As the Clean Air Act has long recognized, it's generally far more efficient and cost-effective to build pollution controls into a facility up front rather than adding them later. But this provision does the opposite. It allows new facilities to be built with insufficient pollution controls and forces more expensive controls on existing sources. That doesn't make any sense. So the amnesty provision in subsection 3D harms the public health and burdens existing manufacturing facilities by allowing new facilities to pollute more than they would be allowed to under the current law. And therefore, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and strike the amnesty provision in the bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Mr. Chairman, just because this is really part of what I talked about earlier, in that there's no reason why the EPA shouldn't issue implementing regulations and guidance at the time and in a timely manner. Again, how do you expect a response by a $1 billion generating facility when you set a standard to meet a 2008 standard and you only tell them how to do it in 2015, and then 2015 you come down with new standards? I mean, it just makes no sense. So when we had the hearing, we had a lot of the state Department of Environment and Air Quality people testified. And there's we always make this assumption that no one else other than the EPA is concerned about clean air. So we make the assumption that the Illinois Environment Protection Agency must not be concerned about clean air, or the Utah air quality people. So they were here to testify on this, and they said a couple interesting things, which is totally opposite of what my colleague and friend from Florida just stated. So in the Colorado Department of Public Health and the Environment said, the absence of timely implementation guidance produces a lack of clarity on on the SIP, the State Implementation Plan expectations, and often creates considerable uncertainty in the planning process. The Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality said too often standards are promulgated without the technical implementation rules in place. This places states in an extremely difficult position. And Utah Department of Environmental Quality said the implementation rule for the 2008 ozone NAAQS was published in March 2015. It's exactly what I've been saying. Only 7 months before the ozone standard was lowered to 70 parts per billion in October. They only gave them the guidelines for 2008, and then 7 months later said, oh, no, we're gonna ratchet it down lower. As another example, the new PM 2.5 non-attainment areas were designated in 2009 state implementation plans. For those areas were due to EPA December 2014, but the EPA has yet to promulgate the guidance establish what is required in the plans. Again, there is no reason why EPA shouldn't issue timely implementation regulations and guidance, and I urge my colleagues to support the Section 3D of the bill and oppose my colleague's amendment. And I'll yield to my friend from Kentucky.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I also want to reiterate what is unreasonable to expect that when EPA comes out with these new standards that they should not have the implementation guidelines also. And a 7-year delay is simply unacceptable. And so what we do in this bill, the new standards are not going to apply to pre-construction permits until the guidelines have been implemented. But I do want to point out that the bill expressly states it may not be construed to eliminate the obligation of a pre-construction permit applicant. They must still install best available control technology and lowest achievable emission rate technology. But they should not be expected to have to comply with these new standards until the implementation guidelines have been issued. And so that's what is at issue here, and I express the sentiments of my friend from Illinois of why we would be opposing this amendment.
Will the gentleman yield? This amendment misses a simple fact. EPA can't keep pace with deadlines to lower standards while writing rules for changing previous standards. They need more time. This bill seeks to help EPA so they can implement the Clean Air Act in a way that is actually achievable. Our air quality is improving dramatically. This bill will help continue that improvement. This amendment will destroy that improvement. Urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support the Castor amendment. Regulated entities claim that EPA isn't issuing implementation rules and guidance quickly enough after updating a national ambient air quality standard. And the bill concludes that the solution is to sacrifice public health by allowing facilities to ignore the new air quality standards. And I reject the trade-off suggested by this provision. I'm not willing to expose our kids to unhealthy air in order to speed up permits for polluters. But even if you were willing to sacrifice air quality for faster permits, that isn't what this bill does. This bill allows some facilities to pollute more while doing nothing to expedite the permitting process. So in fact, it would do just the opposite. Under the Clean Air Act, a company that wants to build a new facility must obtain a pre-construction permit that requires the facility to control its pollution. The goal of this permitting process is simple: to ensure that the facility will not significantly increase air pollution above levels that are safe to breathe. Under Section 3D of this bill, if EPA issues a new national ambient air quality standard, that standard doesn't apply for permitting purposes unless and until EPA has issued implementation rules and guidance for the new standard. Besides allowing unhealthy levels of air pollution, this provision doesn't even help states speed up permitting. Witnesses have testified that concurrent guidance isn't always practical or necessary. EPA told the committee that most guidance evolves after a standard takes effect, as states and industry raise questions that require EPA guidance. It's unclear how EPA could provide guidance on solving problems before they even know what the problems are. And this bill basically creates a catch-22 for EPA. On the one hand, EPA could hurry to issue guidance before hearing questions from states and industry. That guidance will necessarily be incomplete, as it won't address issues that only emerge during the implementation process. An industry group that wanted to delay implementation of the new air quality standard could file a lawsuit saying the EPA's guidance wasn't sufficient. On the other hand, EPA could wait to issue more robust and helpful guidance, but in the meantime, facilities would be able to obtain permits under the old air quality standard. A company could build a facility that's allowed to pollute more than it would under the current law. So in both scenarios, the polluter wins and public health loses. And this would provide an opportunity for even more lawsuits and delay. Downwind communities and nearby businesses might challenge a permit that allows a new facility to pollute more and shifts the burden of pollution reduction on them. So all said, this provision amounts to more litigation, more confusion, and more pollution. And there's no reason to believe that it will result in faster permitting. Now, Ms. Castor's amendment would strike just the language in the bill that exempts facilities from complying with new air quality standards, and I urge my colleagues to support her amendment. And I also wanted to say something in conclusion here. A much simpler and more effective suggestion for expediting the permit process is to stop cutting the budget for the EPA and the state permitting agencies. How can we realistically expect EPA and state permitting agencies to do more work more quickly with fewer and fewer resources? We should give them the resources and staff they need to review and process permits on a timely basis. That's a real solution that would make a difference in terms of the permitting process. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, roll call is requested. Vote will occur on the Castor amendment. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Mrs. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no. Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Barton, who looks great back here.
Mr. Barton votes no.
Mr. Lance?
Mr. Lance votes no.
Mr. Guthrie?
Mr. Guthrie votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Oh, how is Mr. Scalise recorded?
Mr. Scalise votes no.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 23 ayes and 31 noes.
23 ayes, 31 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Other members, are there further amendments to the bill?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois has the amendment at the desk. And the clerk will call the say the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4775 offered by Mr. Rush.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. If the majority will not accept the amendment offered by my friend and colleague from Florida, Ms. Castor, that strips the amnesty section from the bill entirely, maybe the majority will consider my amendment. My amendment also gets at the heart of the problem found in Section 3D, but allows states to opt out if including that section will lead to adverse impacts on health and other factors. My list of concerns, Mr. Chairman, with H.R. 4775 are many, but one of the main issues I have with this legislation is that it will permanently weaken the Clean Air Act as well as future air pollution health standards for all criteria pollutants. In fact, Mr. Chairman, in addition to delaying scientifically based health standards and harming the public interest, this bill may also have unintentional consequences for the very industries that the majority is trying to help. If enacted, this bill may actually slow down the issuance of pre-construction permits, increase regulatory uncertainty, leading to additional lawsuits, and shift the burden of pollution control from new sources to existing ones, potentially hurting small businesses. Mr. Chairman, the new standard that EPA recently issued already represents a measured approach that seeks to balance both public health impacts as well as the rule's overall cost benefit, even though this is not a prerequisite of the Clean Air Act. On the other hand, H.R. 4775 represents the exact opposite of a measured approach as it seeks to tip the scales in favor of industry over the public health. Mr. Chairman, my amendment seeks to address many of the problems that may result from this bill, both intentionally and unintentionally. The amendment would strike the section exempting pre-construction permit applications from complying with new or revised national ambient air quality standards if guidelines are not published concurrently with those regulations. Specifically, my amendment simply states that in Section D, subparagraph A, shall not apply with respect to review and disposition of a pre-construction permit application by a federal, state, local, or tribal permitting authority if such authority determines that application of such subparagraph is likely to increase air pollution that harms human health and the environment, slow issuance of final pre-construction permits, increase regulatory uncertainty, foster additional litigation, shift the benefit of pollution control from new sources to existing sources of pollution, including small businesses, or increase the overall cost of achieving the new or revised national ambient air quality standard in the applicable area. Again, Mr. Chairman, my amendment would help to prevent some of the adverse consequences of this bill from going into effect, whether they be intended or whether they are unintended. And I'd urge all of my colleagues to support the Rush Amendment. And I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and rather than using my words of objection to this amendment, I'll use the words from the states that we heard in this very room last week. From the chairman of the Texas Council of Environmental Quality, quote, by lengthening the required review period from 5 to 10 years, it will ensure the EPA does not rush to lower given standards only to comply with a statutory deadline. Furthermore, it will give states more time to comply with previous standards before getting saddled with more stringent standards and facing economic developmental sanctions for non-attainment. And quote, from the executive director of the Utah Department of Environmental Quality, quote, in general, extending the 5-year NAAQS review cycle so that it better aligns with the prescribed NAAQS implementation timelines is appropriate. Extending the review cycle to 10 years would more closely align it with the prescribed planning period of an area designed as serious non-attainment for ozone. And finally, the executive director of the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District, H.R. 4775 helps reduce the current chaotic nature of the transition between standards being required by the EPA issue guidance on implementing new standards in a timely manner and extending a time frame to review new standards from 5 to 10 years. In the San Joaquin Valley, these provisions will reduce the current chaotic nature of the transition between standards. The streamlining remedies provided in H.R. 4775 will not delay aggressive efforts to reduce air pollution and improve public health in the San Joaquin Valley. If a state, local, or tribal permitting authority wants to impose more stringent state permitting requirements with respect to a particular pre-construction permit application, nothing in H.R. 4775 prevents them from doing so. I urge my colleagues to vote against the Rush Amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other member, gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the Rush Amendment. Section 3D of the bill requires EPA to issue implementation rules and guidance at the same time it issues a new national ambient air quality standard. If EPA does not meet this requirement, the bill doles out a punishment. But it's not the EPA that pays the penalty. It's public health that gets hurt. Under Section 3D, until EPA issues the required regulations and guidance, new sources of pollution get amnesty from certain Clean Air Act requirements when applying for a pre-construction permit. A new facility doesn't have to prove that its pollution won't violate the new air quality standard. It only has to show that its pollution won't violate the old one. But EPA can only update an air quality standard if the existing standard isn't strong enough to protect public health. Applying outdated air quality standards for permitting creates a loophole in the Clean Air Act that allows new facilities to emit more pollution than is safe. This amnesty provision threatens public health, and it's unfair to existing facilities. In an area with unhealthy air, pollution is a zero-sum game. An increase in pollution in one place has to be offset by reductions elsewhere. So if new facilities are allowed to emit more, as this bill would allow, existing facilities will have to emit less to make up for that extra pollution, and adding pollution controls to existing sources is usually much more expensive than building in controls up front. In sum, this provision offers more air pollution, more pollution control costs for existing businesses, more litigation, and more permitting delays. Now, Ms. Castor offered an amendment to get rid of this amnesty provision entirely, and that would be my preferred approach. But if the majority won't agree to that, at a minimum, We should allow state and local permitting agencies to ask key questions and decide for themselves whether the bill's approach of applying outdated air quality standards is a good idea. If states decide the amnesty provision makes things worse, they shouldn't be bound by it. And that's exactly what Mr. Rush's amendment allows. His amendment lets the state reject the amnesty provision if the state finds it would have a harmful effect, such as slowing permitting, increasing air pollution, harming public health, raising the cost of pollution controls, or creating regulatory uncertainty. 2 state air quality regulators have told the committee that the amnesty provision would produce these effects and would be harmful to their permitting efforts. If a state finds that this Clean Air Act loophole will cause harm, the state should be able to opt out and simply apply the updated, more protective air quality standard. Now, we often hear from our Republican colleagues that we should leave more decisions to states and localities, and that's all that Mr. Rush's amendment does. The amendment allows each permitting agency to make its own decision about whether this amnesty provision will help or impede its permitting. And so I urge everyone to support what I consider a very common sense amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush. Roll call has been asked. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton? No. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield? No. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus? Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts? Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden? Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn? Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers? Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper? Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers? Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon votes no. Mr. Flores? Mr. Flores votes no. Mrs. Brooks? Mrs. Brooks votes no. Mr. Mullen? Mr. Mullen votes no. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Kramer? Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Pallone?
Aye.
Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush?
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green? Aye. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette votes aye. Ms. Capps? Ms. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Kennedy? Mr. Kennedy votes aye. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Chairman Upton?
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, clerk will call the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 23 ayes and 31 noes.
23 ayes, 31 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, has an amendment at the desk.
I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4775, offered by Mr. McNerney.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is actually a modest improvement to the bill in response to concerns from the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. We heard at our legislative hearing that communities should not be punished for the pollution they can't control. The panelists agreed that a 100-year drought should be considered an exceptional event. California is enduring a historic once-in-a-century drought. It's the 5th consecutive year of severe drought. 2014 and 2015 were the warmest on record, and thousands of wells have gone dry and land has actually subsided. I think the bill's author did mean well in his efforts to address exceptional events, but the definition is too broad. My amendment is a targeted approach that addresses exceptional events and droughts. It simply allows the EPA to consider a 100-year drought as an exceptional event and may take into consideration data from the U.S. Drought Monitor, National Integrated Drought Information System, historical trends, and information from the state's air resources regulating body. I'm hoping to provide the EPA with the authority to consider a 100-year drought an exceptional event. In addition, the EPA can make more informed decisions when consulting with local air districts, historical data, and the nation's leading drought experts. Another problem we heard at the legislative hearing, and a problem raised in the EPA's draft exceptional events proposed rule, is the lack of available funding and technical assistance provided to air districts for the purpose of demonstrating an exceptional event and monitoring air quality on any particular day. The second part of my amendment addresses this issue by authorizing the EPA to create a program to provide technical assistance, enhanced modeling tools, and cost-effective technologies to air districts. Measuring and qualifying, as well as analyzing air quality data, is extremely difficult and requires valuable resources that many air districts simply don't have. Members, districts that may qualify for an exceptional event should support this amendment because it will provide resources to their air districts and allow the EPA to finally consider a drought an exceptional event. I believe the bill's language preempts EPA's proposed updates to exceptional events guidance, which is anticipated to be finished this year. This guidance acknowledges difficulties in gathering data for demonstrations, what an air district should expect when working with the EPA, and that drought conditions can contribute to exceedances and violations under the Clean Air Act. At the end of the day, the Clean Air Act aims to protect public health. Officials should not ignore all unhealthy air episodes that occur during a drought. California droughts can be frequent and can last for years. And with climate change, that will only get worse. We should not ignore all unhealthy air pollution episodes that occur during a drought, but we should recognize that a 100-year drought has a tremendous impact on air quality. I urge our members to support this amendment. And I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I've not been real active in this bill, but if the amendment is exactly as the author says it is, I would hope we would give it some consideration to support it. Now, I haven't studied it. There may be a Trojan horse here, but if there's not, if it's on the up and up, I would hope we could accept it.
The gentleman yield.
Be happy to.
One concern I have with this amendment is it strikes extraordinary stagnation as part of an exceptional event. It has the 100-year drought, which I agree with, but eliminate extraordinary stagnation hurts many states. For example, from Arizona, the director of the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality testified before this committee last week. The exceptional events rule is of dubious value to Yuma County, if not the whole country. Although Arizona has been a national leader in the development of exceptional documentation for dust events, the process for documenting and receiving EPA approval of ozone exceptional events has not been explained and almost certainly resource intensive and is difficult to predict. So I'm concerned about dropping extraordinary stagnation, but I make a commitment to work with the gentleman from California to address this before it goes before the full House.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the chairman.
Yeah, I wanted to ask council a question or two on this. Under the Clean Air Act as it exists today, Section 319, I believe, it does provide relief to areas that violate national ambient air quality standards due to unusual or naturally occurring events that they cannot control. Is that correct? All right. So our bill, Section 3.8 of Mr. Olson's bill, would add droughts and extraordinary stagnation to the Act's definition of an exceptional event. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And is there a definition for extraordinary stagnation in the bill?
There is not a definition for extraordinary stagnation, but it does clarify that ordinary stagnation is not to be considered a extraordinary event. Only
and there's precedent there's precedent for that at EPA, looking at extraordinary stagnation events.
And that is
yeah. Now, my understanding that the gentleman's amendment, Mr. McNerney's amendment, would limit the relief provided to only 100-year droughts. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So there could be other droughts that maybe not be classified as 100-year droughts that states would not be able to get relief from because of his amendment. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, that's the one that's the reason it concerns me, because at the hearing we had a lot of discussion from state EPAs, particularly in western states, about needing to broaden the definition of an exceptional event so that they could deal with it in a more effective way. And I'm sure that Mr. McNerney has the very best intentions, but he seems to be limiting that exceptional event only to 100-year droughts, which is pretty extreme. So for that reason, I personally would be concerned about this amendment, and at this point, I think I would oppose it, although that's just my view.
Mr. Chairman, does
I have the time. I want to ask the chairman. I want to ask the author a question. You've had two concerns expressed here, where your amendment appears to be replacing and limiting the language in the bill. Are you willing to work with Mr. Olson and Mr. Whitfield to add this extraordinary stagnation and to address their concerns? Are you intentionally trying to limit it? I assume that you were just trying to add something that you didn't think the bill covered.
Well, I think, if the gentleman yields,
sure,
that the current definition is a little too broad. I wanted to narrow it down. So there is
you actually did want to narrow it.
Correct.
Okay. Well, with that understanding, I'm going to turn from a lukewarm support to a respectful against. And I'll yield to Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The discussion on the exceptional event, those of you who visited the Texas Gulf Coast between May and September, we have terrible humidity that contributes to our ozone. I was wondering if that would be a definition for exceptional event, although it happens every year, but it also contributes to our ozone. So. Yeah, that was a rhetorical question.
Gentleman's time from Texas has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I guess you're not getting an answer. I want to support the McNerney amendment. In my opinion, this amendment would make an improvement on the bill's flawed provision to drastically expand the definition of exceptional events, an expansion that would allow the rebranding of poor air quality as safe to breathe and would put the public health of all Americans at risk. While I don't support the general policy of opening up the definition of exceptional events, I believe the McNerney amendment is more acceptable than the underlying bill, and so I just want to commend him, Mr. McNerney, for his work to address the concerns, particularly of his constituents, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the McNerney amendment? Seeing none, the vote will occur on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4775 as amended to the House. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Barton. Aye. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Flores. Mr. Flores votes aye. Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks votes aye. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Miss Eshu. Miss Eshu votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes no. Miss Capps. Miss Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Miss Matsui. Miss Matsui votes no. Miss Castor. Miss Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Mrs. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy votes no. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes aye.
Other members wishing, Dr. Burgess.
Dr. Burgess votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 30 ayes and 23 noes.
30 ayes, 23 noes. The amendment, or the bill as amended, is approved, favorably approved. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and confirming changes to the legislation approved by the committee today, so ordered. And without objection, the committee stands adjourned.